and welcome to the Right Around the Murray Festival 2021 program, which has been reshaped for online presentation. My name's Heather Sirovic and I'm the co-owner of Dymocks in Albury, and I'm talking to you from the Albury Library Museum here on Wiradjuri country, where we pay respect to Wiradjuri elders past, present and emerging. A big thank you to all of you who were tuned in. We truly appreciate your support of the Right Around the Murray Festival and of literature and storytelling and the arts more broadly. We're thrilled to be able to present this session, Pip Williams in discussion with Margaret Hickey, and we thank them for coming online with us. It's my pleasure to welcome Margaret Hickey, who is an author in her own right and has a great new novel out at the moment called Cutter's Edge. Great to have you with us today, Margaret.
Thank you, Heather.
Before I hand over to Margaret to introduce our guest author, I'll let listeners know that you'll be able to type questions for the panel at any time using the chat bar on the right side of your screen, as long as you're logged into Google. Margaret will come to your questions at the end of the session. Enjoy the conversation, everyone, and over to you, Margaret.
Thank you. And what a joy it is to be here at Right Around the Murray 2021. Welcome, everyone. This is going to be a brilliant discussion. Well, Thomas Keneally said that there will not be another book like it this year. I just know it. It's been described as a lockdown sensation, quietly revolutionary, timely and timeless. And that quote by Geraldine Brooks, no less. It's won the 2021 Indie Book of the Year, the winner of the General Fiction Book of the Year, the Australian Book Industry Awards. It's won the People's Choice Awards at the New South Wales Premier Literary Awards. It's been shortlisted for the Christina Stead Award and the Walter Scott Prize. It's been a bestseller and it's much loved. It's sold well over 100,000 copies and now has found its way overseas. It's captured the hearts of people world over and certainly those of us on the border. Welcome, Pip Williams, author of the Dictionary of Lost Words, to Right Around the Murray 2021. Welcome, Pip.
Oh, Marg, what a lovely introduction. And Heather and everybody. I have it in my diary that I'm supposed to be there tonight at Dymocks having an in-conversation with you, Marg, and it's a terrible shame not to see everybody face to face, but a real privilege that we can actually do it online. So I'm really, really happy to be here. And can I just also acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Paramount country. That's the land of the Paramount people of the Adelaide Hills. And I wrote a lot of this book on this land, but also Kaurna country, which is the Adelaide Plains. And we're talking about words today. And I think a lot of us around this country understand that it's First Peoples languages that really are the devastation in terms of lost words. And many languages are being reclaimed as we speak tonight. So, I'd like to acknowledge that.
I read something, it's really interesting you say that, Pip, and so important. And I read something today, something really wonderful about the Noongar language in South, as we know it, as Southwestern Australia, and how that language is being revived and is really vital. I think that's wonderful to hear about how language evolves and,
yes,
and that sort of thing, isn't it?
Yes, and how it can wax and wane, and it's a renaissance, I think, for a lot of Indigenous languages. So which is wonderful.
Well, talking about a renaissance and evolving, I'd like to hear more about your own writing life, Pip. So I know many writers started writing as young kids, as young children, or letter writing. Can you tell us a little bit about your early writing life, and then perhaps even a bit about your travel and how they've inspired you?
Oh, absolutely. And all of the above, really. I did write as a child, really dreadful poetry mostly. And a lot of letters. I've been a letter writer all my life. I still am, in fact. And I have people I write to. Well, one person in particular in Canada, and that's all we do. We try never to use social, email, and we just write handwritten letters.
Was this a pen friend? Was this a pen friend relationship?
No, she's someone I met travelling in Ireland.
Yes.
And we clicked, as you do, and started writing before email existed. and we just kept writing, and we love it. But as a child, I did love writing. And I've mentioned this before, but I'm dyslexic, and obviously I've been dyslexic all my life. So I actually did have a bit of a love-hate relationship with words and dictionaries, ironically, because I really couldn't spell and my handwriting was quite poor. But words and writing was how I needed to express myself, which was maybe bad luck or good luck. I don't know. But
I think for us it was good luck.
And I was lucky because my parents just didn't really care that the words were spelled incorrectly, and they just loved that I was writing poetry, as a lot of parents do, you know. And so I wasn't discouraged from writing, even though I didn't technically execute it very well. But yes, I wrote all through my childhood, really. And until, you know, I think a lot of children love doing things that are creative just for themselves. And that's why I wrote. And then as soon as it becomes something that is performative, something for other people, I think that's when we sometimes stop doing things. And I published a poem. My very first publication was a poem when I was 15.
Can you remember it?
In Dolly magazine. I can remember the beginning.
Can you recite that poem for us?
How embarrassing.
Oh, come on.
Okay. It was very imaginatively called 15, and I was 15, and Mum and Dad had said I wasn't allowed to go out. And so I wrote this poem, and it starts, 15 is an age of just in between. No immature habits should ever be seen. No alcohol served at your table at night. Don't act like a child. You're in people's sight. Act like an adult or go to your room, ... It keeps going. So it was, you know.
Fantastic. And what a thrill, Pip, for it to be published in Dolly magazine.
I know.
I probably read that poem and it would have really resonated with me.
Yeah. I mean, it was a classic. By the way, I still wasn't allowed to go out, but Mum and Dad were very proud of the poem and said, oh, why don't you see if someone will publish it? And someone did. So that was the beginning and end of my writing career for about 30 years. Yeah. Yeah.
And is what brought you back into your writing career, would you say, the inspirations from your travels, particularly in Italy?
I think, like I said, writing was how I expressed myself. So even though I didn't sort of pursue a writing career, I didn't think of myself as a writer, I still wrote all the time. I wrote in a diary. I still wrote bad poetry. I did start 1 or 2 novels as a teenager, and they were all of them, every single one of them was just puberty blues, you know, reshaped, rehashed, repackaged. But I never thought about being a writer. I just did other things. I did the sort of things that might be expected of you. I travelled a lot. I wrote a lot of letters. But the creativity thing, I think, stays with you. And if you don't honour it, it starts bothering you as you get older. And that's what happened to me. So, you know, I actually ended up having a career as a social researcher and academic. And that became more and more dissatisfying. And as it became more and more dissatisfying, that creative urge became louder and louder until I couldn't ignore it anymore. And in fact, going to Italy, traveling around Italy with my family for about 6 months as willing workers on organic farms, the decision to do that was really all wrapped up in a kind of depression that I wasn't writing, although I couldn't articulate it at the time. But the fact I wasn't writing was making me dissatisfied with all the things I was doing. And so we went to Italy as a kind of, you know, a kind of restart. And
you went with your whole family.
We took the kids took the kids out of school and quit our jobs. You know, someone rented the house, all of that sort of stuff, and we travelled and we lived poor and we worked hard and we worked out in a way, it was a journey towards what we wanted to do, though we didn't really know it at the time. And that was my first book, yeah. And so that was my first creative non-fiction book, which is this one here.
Yes.
One Italian Summer, and it was a wonderful apprenticeship, really, for creative writing. I had to unlearn academic writing. Academic writing is very particular, and it's the opposite to engaging creative writing. So, and that was a wonderful way to learn how to write, not just the words and the sentences, but sitting down on your bum and doing it, knowing that it may never be published, knowing that it may never be of value to anybody but you. That's the hardest part about writing, I think.
But it must be such a freeing process to feel that, to think, okay, I'm going to write something like this, and I'm not going to worry about I'm just going to write it to feed this creative urge. That must felt like freedom in a way.
It does. Yes, it does. But it's also a rod for you. It's also demanding, because it calls you to account. It's this all, for 30 years there was that little quiet knocking saying, hey, I'm still here, I'm still here, sort of satisfy my creative urge. I want you to acknowledge me, and I ignored it. But once you open the door to it and you say, come in, you are then responsible for it. And so leaving work, going to Italy, and then deciding after that to write One Italian Summer, in a way, once I started, I had an obligation to that to the creativity. I had an obligation to that story I wanted to tell, and an obligation to myself, I suppose, to see it through. And like any obligation, sometimes you really don't feel like doing it. So, it was like anything else. There was a lot of procrastination. There was a lot of...
it's work. Yeah.
It's work. Yeah. I found that much harder to write, in fact, than the Dictionary of Lost Words. That was a joy. I loved sitting down to that every day. It wasn't a hard thing to do.
I think it reads like that, Pip. From the very first, and I want to say scene, because it's so beautifully evocative of the little girl of Esme sitting under and having read Aladdin, and then the word comes fluttering down like a flying carpet gently under the table and lands in her, the curtain of dust. It does feel like a scene. We can really picture it. And,
thank you.
Yeah, I'm so glad you fed your creative urge, Pip. So we get to sort of jump into it a little bit as well and share it with you.
Thank you, Marg. That's lovely.
I think, Pip, I came to your book in a really terrific way, because I was reading The Surgeon of Crowthorne, and then yes, I was reading it, and I was loving it, and then a friend said to me, "You have to read this new book that's just come out, The Dictionary of Lost," and I got it, and it was like this perfect companion that allowed me to see deeper or to seek a different truth in a way. Would you please talk to us about your relationship or your response perhaps to Simon Winchester's work?
Oh, yes. I mean, it was essential. I would never have written The Dictionary of Lost Words if I hadn't read this book, which is why I always have it next to me when I'm talking about my book, because I read this many years ago now, and it's a fascinating story. Many people have read it. So it's non-fiction, and it's an account of the relationship between James Murray, who is the editor of the dictionary, and one of the people who sent in slips of paper with words and examples of how they'd been used in text. Fascinating story. But by the end of it, once the story faded from my mind, the thing that stayed with me was how the dictionary was put together, how it was compiled. And as a social scientist, my brain immediately went to whether or not the process was valid, whether or not the process was appropriate for the goals of the dictionary, which were the goal of the dictionary was to record every single word in the English language, past and present. So even words that were no longer in use, they wanted to document them and define them. So that was their goal. But the way they went about it was flawed. This is the conclusion I came to.
And this is the academic in you, isn't it?
Yes, that bit
because
was.
This is hardly peer review.
No, I had absolutely no intention or thought of writing a novel about it. I was just curious, and curiosity is where novels start, of course. That's where anything interesting starts. And I was curious about what does it mean for the dictionary, and this is, when I say the dictionary, this really is the dictionary. This is the beginning of all the dictionaries we have on our shelves now. And it's even more important because it's a history of words, where most dictionaries aren't. They give you the contemporary meaning of a word, but this gives you the examples of how words have been used throughout the history, the textual history of that word. And that's the important bit. What I realised was not only were all the editors men, all the lexicographers were men, most of the assistants were men, though there were a few women working on the dictionary, daughters and wives essentially of the editors. Most of the people, but certainly not all, of the people sending in examples of how words were used were men. But most importantly, a word could only get in the dictionary if it had been written down. And this was a Victorian era endeavour up until the final words were published in 1928. Up until that time, the majority of the writings that you might find in the library or on bookshelves were written by men. There was also high levels of illiteracy up until the beginning of the 20th century. And essentially the only people writing anything were educated middle class and upper class people, mostly men. And it occurred to me that the data set was biased towards men and educated men at that. And so I wondered, if men weren't in the birthing room, if they weren't in the scullery, if they weren't at the, down the mines, if the people writing books weren't in these situations, how could they possibly know what words were being used at those times? And is it possible that we've lost words because they were never written down, because they were spoken by the wrong types of people? And that was my curiosity. And then I had two questions. If, does it matter that the English language has been defined by men? Do words mean different things to men and women, essentially? And if they do, then it must matter that the language was defined by a certain group of people. Yeah.
And that's really apparent in your work, Pip, how men, and not only men and women, but how different classes as well. And we talk about class. It's a funny thing to talk about class, but certainly at those times in England, it was a very class defined, and arguably still is probably. But how those different people saw those words, and that comes across in a fascinating way when Esme and Lizzie, of course, are in the marketplaces later on in the book, talking to the women. And whole language. It's like there's whole other languages, isn't there?
Oh, there are, and sometimes it's the same language used differently. So Esme came across words in my novel. What I did was I decided the way I could answer this question, because I actually Googled it. I did try and satisfy my curiosity simply by going to Google and finding out, have words been left out of the dictionary that were particular to women? And I really couldn't find anything that's answered those questions. And so I decided to explore a possible answer. And the way I did that was to put a little girl under the sorting table of the
Mm,
scriptorium where all of the words were being defined. And I would follow her as she grew into a woman and see how the words that were circulating around her all the time, how those words affected her and how she might affect the words. And that was really what I started with and how I decided to explore it. So I've really woven that fictional character through the real history of the Oxford English Dictionary. For me, it was really important not to change anything that I knew was a fact. And when I say fact, I mean indisputable. So certain words were published at certain times. Certain words were defined in certain ways in the dictionary. So I don't change anything like that. I tread very lightly on the real people of the dictionary in terms of putting words in their mouths. I try to stick to the character that I've gleaned from the history, because the men in particular are in the history books. And there's a lot written about James Murray in particular. The women, it was harder.
Women, it was harder. And this brings me on to a really nice, to my next question, and that is to talk about the two beautiful characters of Esme and Lizzie. As friends, as one a bondmaid to the other, perhaps, and lifelong. In a way, Lizzie sort of is the carrier of words, or the keeper in a way. And I'd just like you to talk, please, about that, because I felt on the journey that the Esme went through with the suffragette movement and all that sort of thing, you were really speaking in a way for all women in England, I hasten to say, at that time, or in London perhaps at the time. Can you speak to those two characters and their relationship, perhaps?
Yeah. No, I'd love to. Lizzie is probably my favourite character.
Oh, she's beautiful.
I love Lizzie dearly, and it's interesting how these things come about, even though I did have a general idea of how the whole book was going to go. But as you start writing, you know, things become more important or less important, and storylines, you know, take their own kind of path. Esme doesn't have a mother, which was really important for everything. Nothing could have happened really if she had a mother, because she would have had a very different life. She would have been looked after at home for a start and not gone to work with her father.
And
because
perhaps her language may have been different.
That's right. Exactly. Because in fact, the words of the scriptorium are kind of a surrogate. She turns to the words for advice, like some children would just ask their parents. She asks the words. But because she comes to work with her father, who's a lexicographer, and that was not unusual, by the way. James Murray had 11 children, and all of them spent time in the scriptorium helping out with words and so on. But because she was there, she couldn't be in the scriptorium all of the time. She was small. So the maid from James Murray's house is charged with looking after her as well. And you described her as a bondmaid. She was a literal bondmaid in that she was a servant in the house. And in those days, she was also an orphan. So in those days, children who went into service were practically slaves in terms of they were bonded or they belonged to that house, because they had no safety net. They had no family. They lived in, everything was provided for them. In some ways they were, there were social shackles that kept them there. And so Lizzie sort of represents a Victorian era bondmaid in a literal sense. But as you said, she was also a bondmaid to Esme. So she was bonded to Esme in so many different ways. They were each other's closest friends, and yet there was a big class difference, which meant that they existed in the world very differently. They had different expectations placed on them, and they both knew that in a way, and they lived up to the expectations that were made of them. For me, Lizzie, if Esme's story is the story that lies between the lines of the Oxford English Dictionary, Lizzie's story is the story that, in a way, lies between the lines of my book, because my book is Esme's story, and Esme is a middle-class woman. It's the story of the suffrage movement and the suffragettes. These are middle-class activities on the whole. The suffrage movement and the suffragettes were, on the whole, middle-class women. The suffragettes in particular, in the end, and I'm talking about the WSPU, Emmeline Pankhurst's group, in the end they were willing to sacrifice the vote for working class women in order to get it for educated and landed women. And that's what happened. So, so I'm telling a middle-class woman's story in a way. But, of course, it's not just a women's class, a middle-class woman's story. It's every woman's story. But I couldn't tell every woman's story. And so Lizzie is there in a way as a representative for the working class. But I didn't want to explicitly tell her story. Her story is told really in the space between Esme's story. So we only know things about Lizzie that are important for Esme in a way, but we can glean the rest.
We can. And am I right in saying that they're probably only 6 to 8 years apart? Is that right?
Yes,
they're quite close.
They're only 8 years apart, although, as would have happened, Lizzie has such a hard life that she may seem 20 years older than Esme. Yeah.
And how she speaks. I love when she goes into the marketplace, her language and her demeanour kind of changes, and Esme is the one on the back foot. I thought that was really clever how you did that, Pip. But yes, those two characters, I think, really, and Lizzie for me particularly, I felt a bond, if you like, with Lizzie. I really loved Lizzie and Esme too. I want to speak about an aspect of your writing, Pip, and I don't know if you'll agree with me on this, but this is what I thought. When I looked at your writing, I thought it struck me that there's a beautiful restraint to your style of writing. So, for instance, when Esme experiences bullying at the boarding school, or you could have really, you could have been quite explicit about that. The same goes for grief and for World War One. You could have been, but you hold back. And it's this beautiful restraint, which is really seems to be quite a dignified way to write about these things, and perhaps all the more compelling because you did it that way. Was that a conscious decision, or is that how you've always written, perhaps, Pip?
It was conscious. It is the way I've always written, but it was also conscious. And I have thought about this a lot because when you get somebody to read your work, you get a few people to read your work. Some will say, I want to know what happened to her at boarding school. Or they'll say, I want to know, I want you to write the sex scene, for instance. I want it explicit. For me, the reason I don't tell you everything, or the reason I don't write it all out, is because there are some emotions or experiences that I think are much more affecting when you imagine them. So sex is a really easy one to talk about, but so is grief, and so is trauma. I would never be able to describe a sex scene in a way that will really make you emotionally engaged in it, because what I think is sexy and what you think is sexy is different. I don't presume to know what you will be really engaged with. The same with grief and the same with trauma. Everybody's experience of these things are incredibly personal, and when I'm writing something like that, I like to leave enough room so that the reader fills in the gaps with their own experience and emotional reaction and intelligence, if that makes sense. I don't need to be explicit about the series of, or the process of something, or the series of events that lead up to something. because a reader has enough experience to fill that in themselves. So for me, it was really important not to give too much information, because then I could really deaden a scene for some readers. I could really ruin it.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I wonder if that's just one of the many, many reasons why this book has resonated so strongly with readers, is that there is a deep respect for the reader. You're not telling us how they moved, how they did this, who did this, what to whom. We're left to imagine, and you're giving us that gift back to us. And I think it's it reminded me of Geraldine Brooks, of course, of the writing of Geraldine Brooks.
I can't tell you what
it really did. And yeah, congratulations for that.
Yeah, thank you.
Because in some ways, Pip, I think it would be easier to go all out. I think it would be easier to explain what happened at boarding school and to explain the other horrible, but you've left that to us. And
it can be. And I suppose there's a little bit of a difference between, say, a sex scene and what happened at the boarding school. One of the reasons I didn't want to go into what happened at the boarding school, there were two things. Very often when you experience that kind of a trauma, your reaction is to not talk about it and to not kind of dwell on it in that kind of way. So because this was Esme's story and it was first person, it was really important in a way for her story to reflect the reality of how she would have been feeling about something. And she wanted to put the boarding school experience, she wanted to bury it. And so to sort of bring it up to make it explicit wouldn't really have suited her, the real experience of it. And it comes up in little tiny fragments, as trauma does. You know, you get triggered by little things. And so that's when you find out a little bit about what might have happened. The other thing was the scriptorium was her place. The scriptorium was where her story takes place and not boarding school. And so I didn't want to dwell on boarding school. The scrippy, I mean, Marg, you've frozen. Sorry, could you say that again, Marg? You've just frozen for the moment.
So the scrippy is where the action takes place and where we get that real sense of joy and love of words.
Yeah.
I want to ask you to back to Oxford and how you walk the streets of Oxford and how you read old dictionaries and how you immersed yourself in the content of what you were writing about. Can you tell us about?
You've just frozen, but I think what you're asking is about the research that I did. And yes, like you mentioned, I went to Oxford twice. I was given full access, in fact, to the archives of the Oxford English Dictionary, which was just extraordinary. And that included all of the slips of paper that those words and sentences that I was telling you about were written on. It also included proof pages of the dictionary. It included letters to and from James Murray and from other people, including Edith Thompson, who is in fact a character in the book. Edith Thompson was a woman who volunteered to work on the dictionary, first sending in slips with words and sentences, but she also did proofreading and editing and all sorts of investigations of words, in fact. And she worked on the dictionary from the letter A to the letter Z. So most of her life she spent helping with the dictionary, but she was barely acknowledged for her work in the history. She was acknowledged in the dictionaries. At the front of every dictionary, there is an acknowledgement of the main contributors of words. But you can find hardly anything about her in the history. And so I decided that I wanted to make her a character in my book, and I wanted to give her her real name, because for me it was really important not to exclude her again from what some people, this is the only thing they'll ever read about the Oxford English Dictionary. And it was really important for me to know that people knew Edith Thompson's name. But because she was, I'd fictionalised her life to some extent because she becomes Esme's godmother. And because of that, I get Esme to give her a nickname, and that nickname is Dita. So whenever she's referred to as Dita in the book, that's a sort of indication that that part of it is fictional. But when she's referred to as Edith Thompson in the book, that is part of the history. So I think we're having a few technical problems. We're trying to get Mari back online. I'm very happy to keep talking. If you want to just put me on full screen,
okay,
I can go through some of the history. The historical
That's a great
stuff.
idea. Yes, thank you very much.
When Mark's ready, just drop her in. So it's just you and me now, everybody. So we were talking about the history, and I've got so many. I've actually got a few things I can show you. So when I was at the archives, like I said, they had boxes and boxes of slips of paper with words and the sentence underneath that gives you a sense of what that word might mean. And right at the beginning of the book, one of the things that was a catalyst for this book is a true little bit of history. And that bit of history is that the word bondmaid had gone missing from the Oxford English Dictionary. And no one knows how the word bondmaid went missing. So I investigated this. It's a complete mystery. And so that's why I made my character Esme steal it. And so that's where the book starts. You talked earlier on, Marg, about that word falling in her lap. It's not a spoiler. It happens in the first few pages. So that word is the word bondmaid. And so now I've explained forevermore how the word bondmaid went missing. But when I was in Oxford, I actually asked, could I see the slips? Did they exist? Because they did, because the slips themselves weren't lost. It was the top, well, in fact, the slips and the top slip were all misplaced, let's say. But it's the top slip that had the definition that was written by a lexicographer. That's the thing that was lost back in.
So when they got sent, Pip, when they were sent in, it was my impression that they were, because it really is fascinating. Yes! Is that what one looks like?
No, yeah, these are photocopies. I'll put them close to the screen. So this is a quote from Walter Scott, Lord of the Isles. It's a bondmaid quote. And this is another one from Shakespeare. Yeah. And so if you actually look at the dictionary today, the second edition and the online edition, they have these exact quotes as part of their history of the word bondmaid. But this dictionary next to me, which my partner gave me for my 50th birthday.
Oh, wow.
This is a first edition volume of A and B. And I can assure you
it's a first edition.
Yes. So this is what they were working on. So this was published in 1888. And so it's, it's, how old is that? It's like
what is the first word? What is the first word in that dictionary?
Can we open it up and see?
Let's open it up.
So the very first word, I can tell you what it is. It's A, as in up.
And how is that defined?
Well, I'm going to hold it up because you will run out of time. This is just the first 2 pages of the word up. So this is how far. That's why we've only got 2 letters in this huge volume. They want, like I said, they wanted to record every sense of every word, past and present. Now, in the end, that was impossible, and there were a lot of words that they left out on purpose. And, we can talk about that if you like. I came across a few of them. And I also, when I went to the archives, I had access to the proof pages. So they would print these out and then edit them. And so I had access to pages where I could see that words had been crossed out, and one of the editors had written beside it, excise, so get rid of. And sometimes those words were women's words.
Mm.
And on the same page, so one of those words is the word literately.
Mm.
It almost made it into the dictionary. It means to write something in a literary way or a literate way. It makes
literately.
It makes perfect sense. And in fact, it was put into the dictionary, I think in 1991, but it took that long for it to get into the dictionary.
I can't, for teenagers, it doesn't have the same ring if they say literately.
Yeah. Well, I suppose
my
if you
boys
put
always
it in,
say literally.
well, that's a different word. So literally means, we all know what literally means, but to do something, you could say, oh, the letter was so literately written. Do you see the difference?
Yes.
Anyway, and it makes perfect sense. And you can imagine so many times when you could use it on the same.
Use it.
Yeah, it was crossed out. And so it didn't get actually into the dictionary for decades. And it was originally coined by a Mrs. Griffith back in the 17th century in a novel, in fact. And that's how she was in fact referred to, because they give you the word, they give you the meaning, then they give you a sentence that it's been used in and who wrote that book that it was found in. So it was a Mrs. Griffith had written a novel, and
so if a word, if Mrs. Griffith's word was not counted, would she have received a letter to say, I'm sorry, the word's not, or would it just, it's gone?
Oh, no. So Mrs. Griffith was an author. She was a novelist. Yes. So she was dead. She was long dead because she wrote the book 200 years earlier.
Oh, okay.
No one's consulted about what words that go in other than the lexicographers. But on the same page that that word existed was another word by Coleridge, and that was literata. And this is in the book. I've sort of fictionalized this whole thing, because literata is defined as a literary lady, and not far after that, literary ladies need their own word because there are so few of them. This is what Edith Thompson says in my novel. Whereas literati is literary people. So and so the assumption is that the literati are men, even though the definition is literary people, and that women need their own word. Now that word stayed in, but nobody uses it anymore.
Nobody. It's just fascinating, Pip. We're getting quite a few questions, and I'm conscious of the fact that we may not get through them all, and I want to have people to have the opportunity to ask these questions to you. Laura, are you happy to answer a few questions now, Pip?
Yes, I'd love to.
And then I've got a few more things I want to chat to you as well. But Lauren asks, I would be interested if, Pip, you had a language that you're familiar with. I assume she means, obviously, aside from English. Are there words that are important to you?
The answer is no, I can't speak another language. I've tried to speak Spanish and Italian because we did
Italian
6 months in Italy. My partner is extraordinarily good at learning languages. Some people are.
Yes, they are.
Yeah.
Is your partner a musician? Because isn't that the general tenet that music people and
Yeah, probably. No, he's not. I just don't know what it is. He did learn Indonesian and French at school, so he had an understanding of grammar. And I think this is it. I think people who learn grammar properly, no matter what language it's in, they can then transfer those skills to other languages. Anyway, so because he picks languages up so well, I didn't pick very much up at all when I was in Italy because he did all the talking, and I'm the opposite. I don't pick up languages very well. So I'm afraid I don't have another language, except that I did write a little bit about Esperanto in the Dictionary of Lost Words. And Esperanto is a really interesting language because it was designed designed as a language of community. It was meant to bring people together. And yet it didn't.
No.
But I use that language for various reasons in the book, but it was actually a specialty of one of the real lexicographers who was working in the scriptorium and who Esme, obviously had interaction with. Yeah.
Pip, I have another question. This one's from Rex. And Rex says, I'm so pleased you confirmed your intimate knowledge of the Surgeon of Crowthorne as I had read it before reading dictionary. So Rex was like me that read the two. Yeah. And Rex asks, do you feel like the two texts now, this is an interesting question, Rex. Do you feel like the two texts, Pip, create a whole?
It is an interesting question, and you sort of alluded to it a little bit, Marg, earlier on. And in fact, I've spoken to Simon Winchester. He interviewed me for a festival in Dallas. Obviously, we were in separate countries. We had a fantastic conversation, and it was so nice.
Imagine.
Yeah, I was so nervous, because I do talk about his book, and he agreed that in his book he didn't think about or talk about the women who might have been part of the dictionary. Now, we don't know much about the women, but there were women involved. Ada Murray, for instance, who was James Murray's wife. He could not have done what he did, and what he did was extraordinary. He couldn't have done it without her. No. She was an incredible support for him. James Murray's daughters, 3 of his daughters worked in the scriptorium, and 2 of them for about 40 years of their life. Other editors, their wives and daughters worked with them as well. And when I say worked, I mean it. They were paid workers. They weren't volunteering and just supporting their husbands. They were working women. I think I'm a bit reluctant to say that they can be companion books, because I have so much respect and admiration for the Surgeon of Crowthorne. But what my book does, I hope, and what I wanted it to do, was to tell the story that is between the lines of all of these history books. So, Rex, if you think that it is a good companion, I'm flattered. That is exactly, in a way, what I wanted it to do.
Well, I think Simon Winchester has written about your book, hasn't he? Didn't he? I think he's got a cover on one of the editions on the cover.
Does, yeah. And he said something really funny. I'm paraphrasing, but he said, Pip Williams has gently rapped me over the knuckles.
But
it
was gently, though,
very gently. And he said, and he took it kind of. He
sounds
well.
like a pretty generous man, actually.
Yeah, he is. It was terrific to meet him, actually.
Yeah, well, thank you, Rex, for that terrific question. I wanted to ask too about, and we talked about it a little bit at the start, Pip, about how it's getting very I'm getting very dark here, aren't I? I might have to move over.
You look great, Mark.
Oh, good. I wanted to ask about how language is always evolving. We've talked about that, and how that language waxes and wanes. How important is it then that we document words? If a language is going to die, or if a word is going to die, how important is it that we document it? Or is it just a natural progression that things are going to change? What's your view of that, Pip?
Well, my view is very strong, because if
I can imagine,
if the Oxford English Dictionary hadn't been written, if those words hadn't been documented, I would have had a very poor understanding of how the words had evolved. And how they've evolved is incredibly interesting. So part of my research for this book was to spend hours at the State Library of South Australia, where they have a full set of the first edition Oxford English Dictionary, which is 12 of these massive volumes.
They've got that in Adelaide.
Yes, and it's stunning.
How wonderful. What a brilliant library.
It's really beautiful. And what I found was I would go and I would look for a particular word that I was interested in. and I'd look it up, and this is the other beauty of doing it with a real book and not online, because I'd come across all these other words I'd never heard of before as I was, running my finger down the columns. But often I would find the word that I was looking for, and it would send me to another word. And then that word, I would look at all the sentences through history and see how that word had changed over time as well. Or I would find that one word, and when I showed you the pages for just the word for it's many, many pages. And other words are like that as well. And I had no idea sometimes of how many meanings a particular word might have. And all of that research fed into my story. One of the things that was really important for my book was also that when they were defining the language between 1857 and 1928, they couldn't help but include their judgment of things in the definitions. So we think of these books, dictionaries, and I'd say the same about encyclopedias and so many other, reference books. We think they're completely objective. We go to them because we think they're the arbiters of truth. And in fact, they are as fallible and as easily biased as any other work. And the dictionary has this in black and white. So there are words in the dictionary that I came across, for instance, a really benign word in our, today, which is pants. So, I wore a pair of pants to work today. In the Oxford English Dictionary first edition, pants is defined as a vulgar abbreviation of pantaloons, mainly used in America at that time. The fact they wrote vulgar is telling me a little bit about the person who defined it.
Absolutely.
Rather than the people who use it, because I don't think the people who were using pants were being vulgar when they were using that word. But the educated upper-class man who defined it thought it was vulgar, thought that the way it had been used in language was vulgar. And that was one of the discussions back then. Should we include words that we don't want people to be using?
That we don't want people.
Absolutely. Now I'm paraphrasing, but I
policing. So they wanted to police how the population was speaking and communicating.
Some people did. And so there are letters showing this. But James Murray, on the whole, was incredibly scientific in a way. He had a criteria of inclusion for words. And as far as he was concerned, that was their job, was to record every word. At some point, he was criticised for using quotations from newspapers, particularly tabloids, like the Daily Mail. I think the Times was okay, but not the Daily Mail. And his argument at the time was this is the most up-to-date version of the word. So he acknowledged that the English language and a dictionary was only ever going to be playing catch-up, that it as soon as it was printed, it was out of date, that there was likely to be a new way of using a word. And from the very first publication, he started to collect slips of words that would go into a supplement. So he always knew that the language was continually evolving. And today the argument would be around, do we use Facebook and Twitter as evidence of how words are used? And I don't personally use Facebook and Twitter, but I would defend their use in defining our language because they are the most up-to-date version of how we use words. But what I would also say is let's not lose the history of those words either. We must always make sure that we understand where those words have come from, because that tells us where we've come from, actually. It tells us a little bit about how we as humans and as a society have evolved.
Yeah, and how we interact with each other and class as well. And so and it becomes political in a way too, doesn't it? Political and social.
Totally.
I was going to ask you, and I'll just do it.
Racist comments, the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary. Yeah.
Pip, I was going to ask you, and this is really quickly because Paul and Susan have wonderful questions too. I'm always interested. One of my grandfathers would say, "What's for pudding?" And then the other one would say, my maternal grandparents who lived in the Western District would say, "What is for dessert?" And then other people say, "Sweets." And yes. I think all of those, I'm always interested in what type of, or afters. Words like that, do you think are interesting? I don't know whether you've ever come across that.
Oh, I have, yeah. And in fact, I had to grapple with it too a little bit in this book because there are some words that are used in some parts of the UK, but not in other parts of the UK.
Uh-huh.
And of course, there's dialect. So the Oxford English Dictionary also did include dialect words that were common in use and had been written down, of course. So there's quite a lot of Scottish words Scottish dialect words in the dictionary, and I suspect that's because of Walter Scott and there's so many writers who had used the vernacular of the places where they were from, and so those words got in the dictionary. But like I said, Walter Scott used those words because he was a particular kind of writer, but other sort of words that are in a vernacular of a certain group of people were never written down, and so they didn't get in. And so there's this sort of unfairness in a way around how the words were recorded.
Yeah, the power, who has the power of the words. But Pip, I've got some wonderful questions. Oh, this is a great one. Oh, Susan, yes. Susan says, "I'm always attracted to a book's cover." Or you know what they say about that, Susan? But Susan says, "Did you have a say in the graphics on this book cover?"
I did.
And she also says she loved the book, but it is a particularly beautiful cover. Did you have a say in it, Pip?
Yes. Normally an author doesn't have much of a say in the cover or the title. The title is what the title was as my working title. So the title is exactly what I wanted it to be. Yeah. Yep. But covers are usually left to the publishers and the designers for really good reason. They know what they've done, the research. They know what people are attracted to. They know the market that they're pitching it at and all that sort of thing. But they had actually a bit of trouble with this one, and so they did ask me to contribute my ideas and so on, and together we came up with this. Well, the designer came up with the design based on some of the things I thought were important to the story, including the poppies. So there's some symbolism,
of course.
Yeah, there's symbolism in there that doesn't give anything away, but does put you in a particular era. Perhaps
it is a beautiful cover. Paul asks, "Pip, you mentioned James Murray's 11 children being closely involved. Can you share why you decided, in literary terms, not to include those, especially female children, in your story? But you did actually, Pip, didn't you? There are, yes.
So all of the children who actually worked in the scriptorium are in my story. So Ross Frith Murray, Elsie Murray, they both worked in the scriptorium for about 30 or 40 years, and they are quite prominent in the book.
And I like them, and I like them in the novel too. I like their presence. Yeah, it's
and it's hard. It was hard to write about them because I don't know anything about them, because there's nothing written much about them, and so I had a few bits of information, and I have to. Essentially, my philosophy is just to be respectful and not to judge. And so I didn't turn, obviously, it was not my intention, desire, and I think it would have been the wrong thing to do. I didn't want anybody who was a real person in history to become a villain of any kind, for instance, because they were real people. They had real relationships, they have ancestors, children, grandchildren. That's not my place.
And we know that can be really damaging, because that has happened with other.
Of course.
With other.
Yeah. And so my desire, I had to have these people in the story because they are the real people of the dictionary story. And so I relied on the few bits of information that I had, and then I fleshed them out as kind of benign characters, so that they're I just had to be respectful of who they were.
Yeah,
real people.
Yeah, they're real people. Pip, we're going to have to wrap up soon, but I wanted to ask, do you have a favourite word?
Well, one of my favourite words from this book I probably shouldn't say. I never know whether I'm allowed to say it or not. But I do. Bondmaid but there are a couple of words in this book that have their own storyline. Bondmaid is one of them. The C word is the other, and I have to admit, I love that word when it is used appropriately and with its original meaning. But one of my favourite words, which is in the book, is knackered.
Which is great. Yeah,
which is a word it was not in the dictionary, but there's no doubt it was used, and it means to be so worn out, like a horse that is good for nothing but the knackery, essentially. And it's a really working class word. It's a word of people who do physical labour. But there are a whole lot of words actually that there's another word, I think it's slummock. Slummock, it's an old word which wasn't used even when the dictionary was compiled, but it was included in the dictionary, and it means to kiss sloppily. Sloppy. It's a gorgeous word.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah, and
you could have written about that in Dolly magazine when you were 13.
I know. There are so many wonderful
that's great.
words. Yeah, and there's a few that have come out in the last couple of years, like anthropause, which is this period wherein, because of COVID, where it's the era of it's a human pause, and this idea that because of COVID, everything has slowed down to some extent. They're calling it the anthropause, so I quite like that as well.
Well, Pip, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today, and we're sorry that we couldn't meet with you in person. I hope at some stage, perhaps next year, maybe we will, or sometime in the future. And I'm really excited to hear about your work and what you're going to do in the future, because we've just really been given a gift. It's honestly helped hundreds of thousands of Australians through lockdown, and your book couldn't have come at a better time. So on behalf of those listening, and I'm sorry if I didn't get to some of your questions, thank you, Pip Williams, so much for discussing your beautiful book with us today. Thank you.
Thank you, Marg, for wonderful questions, and everybody who's tuned in for your questions as well. It's been such a pleasure, and I wish I could have been here to chat to you in the signing line. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ladies. That was a really insightful conversation, and it really brought the book back to life for me, Pip. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thanks again for your time, and Mark, for your time. We have both of Pip's books available for you to purchase at Dymocks, so don't be afraid to come and buy them. And I also need to remind you, if you haven't already booked, to head back to the Right Around the Murray website and book in for the Friday or Saturday sessions. Okay, Dymocks are also offering free delivery in Albury, and we have a pickup point in Wodonga if you wish to purchase Dictionary of Lost Words or Cutter's End. Please don't be afraid to be in contact with us. Thank you again, ladies. Thank you to the audience who joined in. And Pip, maybe with another book, we might get you over here for a live.
I hope so, yes.
I'd love to.
It'd be wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And goodbye, everyone.
Thank
Bye.
you, Heather. Thank you, Pip.
Thank you.
Bye. Hi. We can talk now. I've just got to have a wrap.